Our Old Testament lesson today is Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 31. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God's face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Just prior to our text from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is informed of the death of John the Baptist, his cousin, and of the sordid details of his execution. Imprisoned by Herod for questioning the legitimacy of his marriage to his brother's wife, Herodias, John has been in the crosshairs of the king for a while. But Herod has refrained from acting because he feared the reaction of the crowd, because they believed John the Baptist to be a prophet. But at Herod's birthday party, when his wife's daughter pleases him with her dancing, Herod promises her whatever she wants, and what she wants is John's head on a platter, and the king complies. It is this news that Jesus is pondering as our text today begins. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only of Jesus' miracle stories that appears in all 4 of the Gospels. Some scholars suggest that it was read whenever early Christian communities celebrated communion. With its overtly visible display of God's power and grace, and its unmistakable call to Jesus' followers to manifest that grace for others, it is truly a sacramental story. What strikes me most, though, are the stark contrasts, particularly between the world and people, as they so often are, and the world and people as God so dearly desires us to be. In the preceding story, we read of a birthday bash for a king that undoubtedly featured a lavish banquet of the finest foods for a select few, and hedonistic displays designed to appeal to the appetites of a ruthless ruler and his minions. And then in Matthew, we have the most basic of meals that Jesus shares with an enormous and unexpected crowd who travel far out of their way simply to be in his presence and experience his healing. Lack of access to food was the norm in the Roman world. As in most hierarchical social systems, the empire consisted of a small group of elites who enjoyed an abundant variety and good quality of food, and who couldn't be bothered to ensure that others also were fed. Most of the population struggled on a daily basis for adequate nutrition. It's no coincidence that "give us this day our daily bread" was part of the prayer that Jesus taught. That was most people's reality. The masses knew what hunger felt like. Jesus confronts the gross food injustice with a gesture that addresses the immediate needs of the crowd: bread and fish then and there, but also anticipates the coming reign when all God's people will know the abundance that God wants for them. The highlight of the first gathering, Herod's birthday party, was the brutal beheading of John the Baptist by a despot who couldn't bear to be criticized for his own crass behavior and who would not resist the urging to enact violence, even if it might incite more violence. Motivated by fear and self-interest, Herod the host commands the death of an innocent man. But in Matthew's story, we see that a grieving Jesus looks beyond his own need for quiet and time alone after hearing that John the Baptist has been murdered, in order to minister to the needs of the crowds who follow him. He is moved to act by compassion, the text says, and he expects his inner circle, his disciples, to respond in kind to the people they would just as soon send away. Motivated by love, Jesus, the host, offers the life-giving command that the hungry be fed. There is also in this story itself a contrast between the enormity of need, 5,000 men with growling stomachs, not to mention women and children, and the seeming scarcity of resources, 5 measly loaves and 2 fish. Similarly, there is a difference between the disciples' perception that they have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus' understanding that whatever they have, it will be enough. You give them something to eat, Jesus tells them as they initially opt out of caring for the crowds. One more time in his teaching, he shows them that following him is not an abstract proposition, the acceptance of doctrine or a matter of belief. It is instead the ongoing expression of faith in concrete acts of love, justice, and compassion toward others. God's power, he shows them, is accessible when they need it and when they work for good in the world, despite their limitations. And indeed, when the disciples come together and follow his lead, there is not only enough, but there is more than enough. 12 baskets full. And maybe the most glaring juxtaposition of all in the story is between what is blessed and what is broken. Or maybe it's the fact that what is broken is blessed. Whenever we gather at the Lord's table, we hear this familiar pattern. Jesus takes and blesses and breaks and gives bread. But as he sits in grief in the wilderness, he also takes and blesses and gives himself to the gathering of hungry people, to the sick and the tired, to the ones who look to him for what no one else will provide, a morsel of food and a place at the table and an acknowledgement that their hunger matters to him. He who is blessed and he whose body will soon be broken takes and blesses and gives. When we listen to the contrast between the world, what the empire demands and expects and provides, we hear a lot about self-satisfaction and self-sufficiency and scarcity. The message is that there's only so much to go around, and we need to elbow our way to the front of the line and grab ours first, because, every man for himself. But Jesus' demands and expectations and provisions are different. He calls us to dream bigger than that. He calls us to change our ideas about our own power in the world and God's power in the world, and about how much is enough and about who is entitled to what. And he calls us to an attitude of abundance and generosity that we too can take and bless and break and give with the expectation that there will be plenty to go around. Because we who are broken in so many ways, we too are also blessed. We don't have any records of Jesus attending committee meetings. We have a whole lot of stories of Jesus eating with people. He was a potluck over polity kind of guy, I think. His most significant and revelatory work usually involved a table and some food, or in this case, a patch of wilderness for 5,000 of his closest friends, and some fish and bread and baskets for the leftovers. We ought not to be surprised that his ministry was centered on the most fundamental human need, hunger. Physical, spiritual, and otherwise, and on satisfying those needs with the bread of life rather than the stuff that cannot fill and does not last. Naomi Shihab Nye is an American poet, songwriter, and novelist of Palestinian, Islam, and American Lutheran descent. And I want to read to you her poem titled Gate A4. Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled on the floor, wailing. "Help," said the flight attendant. "Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this." I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke haltingly in Arabic. The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "No, we're fine. You'll get there. Just later. Who's picking you up? Let's call him." We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him that I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and ride next to her. She talked to him. And we called our other sons just for the fun of it. And we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up to 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar, crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, from her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There's no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country tradition, always carry a plant, always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones, and I thought, this is the world I want to live in, the shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. So thanks be to God this morning for blessing our brokenness and feeding our hunger and giving us the invitation to do likewise for our neighbors and strangers. Amen.